just so exciting for our commercial producers whom we serve that they're in a marketplace that's expanding and there's a vast appetite for more pork. And we're the people who provide this unique and leading genetic breeding stock to them to start that whole cycle. It's exciting to be in a growing global business, and we're step one in the chain.
We've got Dr. Laura Greiner. Laura is an assistant professor at Iowa State University, where she currently has a 50% teaching, 25% research, and 25% extension role. Her current research focuses are on gilt development and sow immunity. Prior to her arrival at Iowa State, Laura worked as the director of research at Carthage Innovative Swine Solutions and oversaw sow and wean to finish research for 13 years. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Laura Greiner.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back out today and spending some time with us to talk about sow nutrition and particularly sow production. So today I was tasked with the idea of thinking about where we're going to be in the future for sow nutrition. If I knew that exactly today, I probably could retire. But I'm going to give you a few things that I'm going to think about, or what I am thinking about in terms of the next 5 to 10 years in terms of sow production, where we're at, where we're headed, and what trends we've been seeing over the last roughly 10 years prior to now. Certainly it's no surprise we have different genetics, therefore different nutrient requirements, right? For years we've talked about different genetic lines. They all have different eating patterns. They have different capacities for feed consumption. This is no different from where we're looking 5 to 10 years from now, but the more you talk to groups out there, the more we're hearing further and further separation, particularly in nutrient requirements that we're getting from our genetic companies. So different genetic bases are recommending different amounts of amino acids, different amounts of energy for their sows, and their management programs around that are changing. And so what I kind of see happening is, while we try to group all of our sows together, that's not the case, right? They are going to continue to be treated differently. So if you're going to use a genetic base from one company versus another, you really do need to continue to get to know that sow, understand her eating patterns, make sure you're matching her lysine and nutrient requirements to those feed intake patterns. The other thing that we're certainly going to continue to talk about, and I believe we're going to really focus in on in the next 5 to 10 years, is sow survivability. We can no longer keep this in the closet. We have to get it out. We have to figure out what's going on, because we do see survivability rates decreasing on our farms. That is a trend that's been happening over the last 15 years, and to be honest, it's a trend we need to stop. And so when we think sow survivability, I think we all know today, this is not something that happens when the sow is in her third parity. This is something that we have to start when this animal is a gilt, when she's developing, and potentially even before that, whether it's in utero prior to this, or even while this gilt is on its own mother. So we certainly want to continue to think about sow survivability and where we're headed, and then of course focusing in on what's happening around those 3 weeks, both pre and post farrow, because those are of course our most critical time point for a sow when we think about mortality. As Kara just went through, certainly we need to understand differences in immunity, difference in colostrum, what these sows are going to be bringing to our piglets, and more importantly, if we understand what that milk quality is, making sure our nutrients match what that animal is capable of producing. And then lastly, obviously, as everybody knows, money is king, and so we're going to have to control the economics. While most of us consider the sow farm a cost center, we still do have to look at it in a different way, perhaps, as while it is costing us money to raise those pigs, if we skimp too much on the front end, we're going to end up costing ourselves, of course, in the finishers. So what is on the horizon? Survivability, as I mentioned. You know, we can certainly go down this list with pig survivability, lameness, gut health, disease intervention. It is not going to be one piece. Right, I think we've all understood for years that nutrition doesn't stand alone from health, health doesn't stand alone from genetics. And so while I'm going to stand up here today and talk about one piece of nutrition, it is actually going to be multidisciplined in order for us to be successful moving the needle. So why? Why am I even here? Well, let's put some economics to today's discussion. Every day today that we have a sow on a farm that is not productive, meaning she is not pregnant or nursing, she is costing that farm anywhere from $2 to $2.50. With current feed costs, some places are up to $3.50. Okay, so certainly it's an expensive time to be leaving those sows in a non-productive stage. Sow longevity, I think we recognize that replacing a gilt today costs over $400 a gilt, probably pushing closer to $500 today. So again, we don't want to continually be replacing females. We lose it both on production as well as just cost of replacement. Pig survivability, of course, is a big one. Any pig we can save will bring the farm potential of about $40 a pig. Okay, other reasons why we need to continue to follow the farms. There's nothing going on that's unique or novel, but we do know that heat stress occurs. It occurs very much in the Midwest. It occurs very much in southern U.S. And so heat stress and disease are going to continue to impact production for the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years, right? And the last thing that we really want to think about when we talk about nutrition is where we're headed with total born. So while we can say 10 years ago we were producing litters of about 10 to 12 piglets, today we're well over 15. If we look at a lot of our genetic requirements, most of that data is older. Most of that data is back when our sows are producing and weaning 10 to 12 pigs. So we have to continue to push ourselves from a nutrition background as well as research to make sure that we're meeting the sow's requirements for this higher total born and higher milking requirements. So the first thing we're going to do today is we're going to jump into the GDU. I always like to start at the beginning and work towards the end goal, which is of course our sow in lactation. So one of the things that we continue to discuss with these energy levels and gilts is, do we slow down growth? Is that in fact beneficial for our gilts? Certainly today we continue to hear more and more conversation focused around fiber, types of fiber in our gilt developments, and we're starting to see more data that would indicate that if we can slow these gilts down just a little bit, we have the potential to improve joint health and potentially sow longevity and her reproductive performance. Some other work that our lab was working around was related to the types of fat that we're including into the diets, because we're focused in on joint health. Okay, so again, sow lameness is a primary cause of removal, and so what can we do from a nutritional aspect to keep that sow from leaving the herd too soon? Well, one of those things, of course, is how do we improve those joints? If we go into cat and dog research, certainly there's a lot of research that focuses on linoleic and linolenic acid ratios and how those can actually impact and improve joint health. So we did some studies where we first looked at different energy, whether we did high energy or low energy diets in our gestation barns, or sorry, not in gestation barns, but in growing gilts. And then we also looked at that type of energy ratio. So how much linoleic versus linolenic acid did we add? And we tapped into the synovial fluid of some joints on the hocks, and we looked at inflammatory markers. Interestingly enough, we did not see any differences, whether we fed high energy or low energy, or whether we changed the markers, or I'm sorry, whether or not we changed the ratios. In this data set, though, what we did find was that we did influence, by changing the ratios, we influenced the growth rate of the gilt. And in fact, some of our ratios had gilts performing at an equal growth rate of that of barrows, which is a little bit concerning, potentially. Okay, so from there we continued to dig into this pathway a little bit more. And we looked, again, at some additional ratios, assuming that we kept energy the same. And we followed it one more time, and we did not see any differences in those joints. So while we know that there is data, particularly in cats and dogs, that would suggest that feeding different types of fats, particularly between linoleic and linolenic acid ratios, can improve joint quality. And in fact, in the growing gilt, we did not see this response. Okay. So we're going to continue to look at this. We're going to particularly finish some work recently trying to understand why those ratios might be influencing growth rate. More importantly, one of the graduate students spent some time then collecting ovaries on those gilts, trying to follow them through to see if the faster growth actually negatively impacted performance. So we're working on completing that data at this point. But that's just a sample of some things that we should be thinking about when it comes to gilt development. There are many things that we're also exploring in terms of mammary development. While most of the mammary gland development does not occur until after the female goes through puberty, there are questions about what can we be doing with that gilt that could potentially improve mammary capability when she is in fact older. So if we think about gestation, where are we headed in the next 5 to 10 years? I mentioned total born. As total born is increasing, this population of the 700-gram piglets increases in our pool. So we get more and more animals that are on that low side, those very small weight pigs. I don't think that's anything of a surprise to any of you in the room. This is something we've seen for the last 10 years. But what do we do with those piglets is going to be ever critical. And so, of course, this is where Kara is working extensively on how we understand them in terms of colostrum. But from the sow perspective, what can we potentially feed that sow to minimize that variation? Right? So again, I'm not telling you anything we haven't discussed in the last 5 to 10 years. We continue to talk about variation. We continue to talk about how do we minimize this. This is a topic that's going to continue because at this point we haven't successfully managed it. Some of what I think is going to change in gestation really focuses around the feeding stations. When we think about labor being short, we've got to address the labor situation because animal caretaking definitely has an influence, as we know, on animal survivability. So feeding stations are not just going to be used to feed animals. We're going to be needing to use those feeding stations more to help our labor recognize when animals are struggling, when they're not getting up to eat. We've been talking about using cameras to predict fevers, et cetera. Right? So any way we can use feeding systems in a non-nutritional way is going to be critical to our industry moving forward. The other thing to think about with gestation is whether or not we will be parity segregating feeding in gestation. This is a conversation, again, we've had for 10 to 15 years. Do we feed the gilts differently than the older sow? Again, we recognize that nutritionally they do have different requirements, but because our gilt population makes up a small population in gestation, and it's expensive to have different feed lines and different management, we've chosen not to do it. And that's where I really want to think about or challenge you all today is many of the things we're going to talk about, we have said over the years economically, it's not an option. And when we get to the lactation portion of this, I'm going to show you some numbers where I've continued to hear this economically it's not an option, and I'm going to show you that economically it is an option. And so we need to get past this mindset of continually saying economically this is not an option. We're being challenged to change our housing. Right? We're being challenged to consider changing with Prop 12. If we are in that situation, then why are we not considering parity segregation? Why are we not doing this at this point? Okay, the other piece of this, when I think about nutrition and gestation that I see changing in the next 5 to 10 years, is really this continual discussion around fetal imprinting. We know that maternal nutrition changes immune function, growth, development, leanness. But I don't have those conversations with my producers today. Not once do I have one call me and say, hey, let's change my gestation diet so I have a leaner offspring. Let's change my gestation diet because I'm putting these pigs into PRRS populations. And I think there's some great potential there. We have some research. We don't have all the pieces to answer these questions right now. But if I look at the next 5 to 10 years, I think this is a piece that would be really critical to us, is to look at that fetal imprinting, think about how we can nutritionally change those diets and get those offspring in a better place by changing what we feed mom. It's not hard to do. So why? Why did I just stand up here and tell you that? Well, if we just look at some numbers here, if we change fetal growth rate just in those last 2 weeks or so of gestation, what we can see is that every 28 grams that we improve that birth weight, we're going to save ourselves about 50 cents marketed. Okay, those numbers are real, they're repeatable, and so there's high opportunity in changing what we do in gestation to bring us value in the barn. So let's flip over to lactation. When I teach my students lactation, we always stick with a rule of thumb. Every sow needs 4 pounds of feed a day for her maintenance and 1 pound of feed a day for every piglet she's nursing. So today, if you have a sow that's nursing 15 pigs, and I know some of you have them, that's 19 pounds of feed every day she needs to eat. How many of you have sows that are routinely eating 19 pounds of feed every day? On average? On average? No.
21 days.
17.
On 21 days.
Yeah, that doesn't count the ramp up of the 7 pounds a day for the first one.
That's right. That's right. I'd love to have a sow that did that, right? I can see it the last week. Man, they can clear 30 pounds out of a feeder, no problem. But they don't do it right away. So let's talk about this, okay? Every kilo of body weight that she loses in lactation is going to take 4 kilos of feed in gestation. I get it, gestation feed is cheaper. Folks, it's not that much cheaper. What is it, 2 cents cheaper? So we need to do a better job in lactation. It is costing you more money to not feed her appropriately in lactation than trying to play catch up in the barn, okay? The other thing I want you to think about, and if you've ever hand-fed sows, you all understand it. These are not cookie cutters. These are not widgets in a factory. We love to pretend like they are, but they eat differently. This is a population of sows, 112 sows and 2 brooms, and you can see that they eat at different levels. So if I'm going in here and my nutritionist says I need to have 62 grams of feed in every, or 62 grams of lysine in every sow every day, and I've got that kind of variation at day 3, how are you going to manage that? Right? And we do know, as Chris mentioned here, we see changes in feed intake as they go through their weeks of gestation, and we see even more variation by those weeks in terms of their ability to consume lysine. And we see that variation, of course, across parity as well. So this is where I go back to technology and being able to use technology in the barn. Most of you know I'm extremely passionate about making sure our sows get the right amount of lysine in lactation. I'm a firm believer of it. I spent many years doing this work, and we know as we continue to have more and more litter weight on those sows at the time of weaning, their lysine requirements increase. And if my feed intake is not increasing proportionally, that means as a nutritionist I'm putting more lysine in the diet. And then my farmer calls and complains because their pound of feed cost keeps going up. Right? Well, we're also looking at other things, but just something to think about. It has a real impact. If I can't meet the lysine requirements of that gilt, so if I'm over here at 50 grams of lysine, her wean to estrus is higher. It's longer. Non-productive days are higher. More added cost to that animal because we're not managing her lysine. We also know that as that sow loses protein, she has fewer number of primary quality follicles ready for the next ovulation event. So again, as we see that lactation protein loss going up, we can go from 25 primary follicles down to 9.7. Okay, so again, we talk about total born. We talk about we want more total born. Maybe the total born's already there. Maybe we're just not ensuring that we're preventing the protein loss. Okay, so again, we've talked a little bit here now about wean to estrus intervals and the impact, and let's just run through a quick scenario. Okay, so in this herd, we're going to feed 1.05% digestible lysine in the lactation diet. These sows are going to eat just around 12 pounds a day, 13 pounds a day on average. So I recognize that's a little bit low for most of you today, but let's pretend it's summer. Okay, that's probably a fair estimate still for summer. So if we look at our older sow in that population, she's going to be that average, right? They are predominantly the percentage of that population. So that parity 3, she's going to eat about 13 pounds of feed every day. And she's going to get that target of 62 grams. But that gilt doesn't eat what a sow eats, right? She has a limited capacity. She's still growing. She's only going to eat maybe 11.5 pounds, and that's on a good day. So she's only going to get the 54 grams. Okay? So let's go back to this slide. 54 grams means I'm going to have a 5.4 wean to estrus versus in getting her to 62 puts her at a 4.5. So I almost lose a whole day's worth of production by not meeting her lysine requirements. And so again, we talked about it in gestation. It's going to come up again. This is what I think we're going to see in the future is parity segregated feeding. We need to address the lysine deficiency. And one of the ways that we can do it is manage the barn differently. We can certainly top dress gilt rations. We've tried it in the past. Not all top dressing rations are ideal. They can be a little bit bitter if we try to put a lot of soybean meal in them. Not to mention most of our farm staff don't really want to go through and throw a pound of feed on top of everything when the feed tubes are being dropped, if they can even access the feed while it's coming through the feed lines. So the other option we have is to really think about feeding those gilts separately. So here are the numbers I promised you that I would share. They're a little bit hard to read, but I just ran through this scenario for a producer a couple weeks ago. So here on a farm where we're parity segregating the gilt versus the parity 3, we created 2 different diets, and we assumed that the gilt was only eating about 1 pound less than the sow. Okay, so we get through feed intake and feed costs for those females. We, of course, looked at the diet, so we gave the gilt more lysine in her diet because we knew she was eating less. The goal was to get everybody to 62, 65 grams for this farm. So we were able to accomplish that. And then we factored in non-productive days and the cost of those days for that producer. So by parity segregating the animals, we're going to assume, and this is an assumption, that the gilts are not going to lose weight because we're attending to their requirements appropriately. And so if we look at that, we're going to see, based on the distribution of a herd, where we have, 60 gilts for every 250 sows roughly, we're going to see that the total feed cost for that animal in lactation is going to be about $51.42. Where if I'm over here in the whole herd, I'm going to feed to the herd lysine requirement. I'm going to feed to the herd feed intake average, which means my gilts are going to be underfed their lysine. They're going to have a reduction in subsequent total born. They're going to have smaller pigs being weaned, and they're going to have an elevated wean to estrus interval and weight loss. And so when we factor that in, we're actually looking at almost $57 per animal. Okay. So there we're seeing roughly $5.50 difference between parity segregating and not. That starts to pay for a feed system after a few turns. Okay, if you think I'm crazy, I pulled this out of a publication from Amanda Udemark. And Amanda had a little bit different numbers, but she was looking between $3.06 for gilts and $5.40 and $8.90 for sows. Okay, so numbers are very real. These were her calculations from 2019. The calculations I just gave you were from last month, 2021. The other thing I continue to push, and for those of you who've worked with me in production systems in the room, you can scold and yell at me all you want, but I am a big fan of wet feeding and lactation. We want to sit in here and we want to talk about getting feed intake up on our sows because they're not eating the 18 pounds of feed that they need to eat every day. One way that we can do that is by adding water nipples into those feed pans. I know it's a nightmare. I get it. I get feed wastage, I get feed spoilage, but I've talked to more and more producers that are finding novel ways or finding novel feeding systems that are having success with wet feeding, and they are seeing this improvement in feed intake of 10 to 15%. Okay, so simple technologies can sometimes help us significantly as we continue to move down these points of having to address this need for higher feed intake in our sows. Okay. In addition, some of the feed system technology, again, can address the labor shortage challenges, sending signals when sows aren't eating, sending signals when feed curves are off, helping those producers take notification of when there's problems. The last couple pieces I'm going to throw out here today are ones that I think we have to ask ourselves in the industry, myself included. I have never been a huge fan of fiber in a diet. I mean, obviously I feed a lot of dry distillers grains, but as far as getting really serious about the types of fiber that we use, it's not one that's been in my vocabulary for many years. But as we continue to look at the data that's coming out of Europe and other places, I think it's something that we need to take quite seriously. Particularly when we listen to Kara and we're talking about colostrum intake, and we see that different types of fiber can influence different amounts of colostrum intake. This is something we need to take notice of. In addition, different types of fiber can influence farrowing duration. So challenges with stillborns, etc., can be influenced by fiber. And again, coming from a system, I get it. We focus on the economics. The type of fiber we're talking about here is not distiller's grains. It's not cheap fiber. But yet when we have to go beyond just the cost per pound of feed and we start looking at the potential value it brings by saving one extra pig per sow, saving that $40 per sow, changing 1% in piglet survivability, 2% in piglet survivability because of colostrum. Maybe the economics are there. Okay. Lastly, I won't do my due diligence if I don't talk about health. I am still a firm believer that everything we do with the sow influences the offspring and thereof, and certainly nothing surprising there in terms of microbiome. We know that the microbiome of the piglet closely represents that from the mom, and so we need to be thinking about that as we move forward. That microbiome has immunomodulatory metabolites that are produced and transferred to that offspring. Okay, that helps educate that offspring's immune system so that they're ready to fight disease, they're ready to respond to those vaccines that you're giving. We know that the maternal antibodies that comes from mom's colostrum influence the microbiome of that piglet's gut. And we also know that it can control inappropriate inflammatory responses throughout their lifetime. So gut microbiome for the piglet is going to be ever important. In addition, there's been some nice work out of Maria Peters' lab up in Minnesota, where she's demonstrated that certain types of organisms within the microbiome can actually reduce the lung lesion scores when pigs are exposed to mycoplasma. So if I have the ability to set the gut up right from the piglet that comes from mom, I have the potential to maybe reduce the severity of mycoplasma or other respiratory challenges that I might be experiencing in the finishing barns. We've done some work as well where we've been tracking this, looking at different types of pathogens and organisms within the microbiome and how that changes by parity. And again, no surprise, we see differences by parity. And so our group is starting to work through this now of how can I get that gilt to be more like that sow and get the microbiome that we want, right? Because we know that piglets that come from sows have a higher survivability rate than the piglets that come from gilt litters. And if the microbiome is influencing all the things I just told you, then how do we get that microbiome of the gilt to be more like the sow? Because clearly today it is not. Other things that are certainly things to keep in our minds as we move forward are different ways to disinfect feed. I don't think that's going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. We have to continue to challenge ourselves as an industry and of course continue to work on heat stress. So with that, I'll acknowledge all the different groups that have supported our research as well as my graduate student team and my undergraduates, and thank you for your time.